The mid-morning sun cast long streaks of gold across the manicured lawns of Briarwood Medical Center. Elena Carter stood at the edge of the walkway, her breath catching in her chest as she took in the sight of the hospital she had dreamed of working at for so long. The imposing structure gleamed with glass panels, each reflecting the hopeful blue of the sky. It was a symbol of progress, but to Elena, it carried the weight of untold stories, both triumphs and trials. Elena's fingers, calloused from years of hard work, clenched and unclenched around the strap of her satchel. She wore a crisp white uniform, spotless but already marked by the anxiety of a new beginning. Her father's words rang in her ears, a steadying mantra she had repeated to herself countless times. "Hold your head high, baby girl. You belong here, just as much as anyone else." Stepping through the automatic doors, she was greeted by a blast of sterile, chilled air. The scent of disinfectant mingled with the faint aroma of cafeteria food. The lobby was a whirlwind of activity. Doctors rushing by with their lab coats flaring behind them, visitors chattering nervously, and nurses navigating the controlled chaos with practiced ease. Elena swallowed her nerves and squared her shoulders, stepping into the fray. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the nursing director's office is?" she asked a passing nurse, whose expression flickered with something indiscernible, curiosity or perhaps judgment, before shifting to polite indifference. "Down the corridor, third door on the right," the nurse said, her tone clipped. She turned away before Elena could thank her. The door to the director's office bore a polished brass plate with the name Linda Reynolds, RN, Director of Nursing. Elena took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," a voice called, stern but not unfriendly. Elena entered, taking in the sight of a meticulously organized office. Files were stacked neatly, and the shelves held medical reference books and framed certificates. Linda Reynolds was seated behind a mahogany desk, her blonde hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over Elena. For a moment, neither spoke, the room holding its breath. "You must be Elena Carter," Linda said, breaking the silence. "Yes, ma'am." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Elena replied, infusing her voice with as much confidence as she could muster. Linda gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit down. We need to go over some things." As Linda outlined the protocols and expectations at Briarwood, Elena nodded attentively. The director's voice carried authority, underlined by years of experience. But there was something else, too, a hint of weariness, as though she had fought many battles within these very walls. "We maintain high standards here, Miss Carter." "I trust you're prepared for that," Linda said, leaning back in her chair. Elena met her gaze, refusing to waver. "I am." With her initial meeting behind her, Elena moved into the main hall, trying to familiarize herself with her new surroundings. The nurses' station was a hive of activity, buzzing with hushed conversations and hurried movements. Her eyes met those of Dr. Mark Holden, a tall man with salt-and-pepper hair, who was discussing something with a colleague. His sharp eyes found hers, and he paused, giving her a once-over that made her skin prickle. "Are you the new nurse?" he asked, his voice cold and detached. "Yes, Dr. Holden. I'm Elena Carter." He nodded once, as if ticking a mental box. "Make sure you're up to speed. We don't have room for mistakes." Before she could reply, he turned on his heel and walked away. The interaction left a bitter taste in her mouth. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Dismissive, assumptive. She clenched her jaw, remembering her father's words. "Never let them see you falter." The next few days were a blur of tasks, brief introductions, and learning the unspoken hierarchy of Briarwood. Elena worked tirelessly, taking on challenging cases and proving herself to be efficient and compassionate. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was constantly being watched, evaluated not just for her skill, but for any sign of weakness. During a quiet moment at the nurse's station, Elena found herself next to Jessica Lane, a nurse whose demeanor fluctuated between polite and distant. Jessica glanced at Elena, hesitated, then spoke. "So, where did you work before this?" she asked, more out of curiosity than friendliness. "Green Hill Clinic, a smaller hospital in the city. I was part of the trauma team, Elena said, a touch of pride in her voice. Jessica's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's impressive, she said, before turning her attention to the chart in her hands. The conversation was over before it began, but it was the first time someone had shown any interest beyond the bare minimum. As the week wore on, Elena noticed subtle shifts in how she was treated. Tasks were reassigned last minute, leaving her with the most complicated patients. Questions she raised during team meetings were often ignored, yet when repeated by another nurse, were met with nods of approval. The small slights added up, each one carving away at the hope she had carried into Briarwood. It was late one night when Elena caught a conversation that made her blood run cold. Passing by the break room, she heard Jessica and another nurse whispering, "I don't know why they brought her on." "We don't need someone like that here," one voice said, followed by a hushed laugh. Elena stopped, her hand gripping the handle of the cart she was pushing. The sting of the words settled deep in her chest, but she forced herself to move on. There was no time for anger, only for determination. Elena's second week at Briarwood began with a storm of tasks. Each day felt heavier than the last, the expectations growing as colleagues observed her every move with thinly veiled skepticism. She handled complex patient cases, from post-surgery complications to urgent trauma arrivals, all under the hawk-like eyes of Dr. Mark Holden and Linda Reynolds. One afternoon, just as Elena was preparing to change the dressing of a patient in the recovery ward, she heard Dr. Holden's voice behind her. "Nurse Carter, are you sure you're prepared for this?" His words, though framed as a question, carried the weight of a judgment. Elena met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, doctor," she said firmly, her hands moving methodically as she applied her training. "Doctor?" Holden watched for a moment longer before turning on his heel, muttering something under his breath that Elena chose to ignore. The silence that followed was tense, but Elena kept her focus. The patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, gave her a sympathetic smile. "You're doing fine, dear, Mrs." Holloway whispered, her voice raspy but warm. It was a rare moment of encouragement that filled Elena's chest with a fragile sense of validation. Later that day, Elena found herself sitting in the staff room, exhaustion pinching at the corners of her eyes. Jessica Lane walked in, glancing at Elena before taking a seat across from her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the vending machine and distant beeping from the hallway the only sounds. "You handled Mrs. Holloway's dressing well," Jessica said finally, her tone neutral but lacking the earlier tension. "Thanks," Elena replied, surprised but cautious. Jessica looked down at her cup of coffee, fingers drumming lightly on the styrofoam. "It's not easy here. Everyone's so set in their ways." Elena studied her, sensing an unspoken layer beneath Jessica's words. "Why did you decide to stay?" she asked. Jessica's eyes flickered with something like regret. "Maybe I was hoping things could change," she admitted, barely above a whisper. That evening, Elena's routine took her to Richard Monroe's room. He was awake, his eyes bright despite the shadows of fatigue that creased his face. "Good evening, Mr. Monroe. How are you feeling today?" she asked, slipping into her professional tone. Richard smiled, a wry expression that hinted at knowledge beyond his patient chart. "Better, thanks to you," he said, watching her with an intensity that made her pause. Elena resumed her work, but she felt the weight of his gaze. It was not the disinterested, dismissive look she had become accustomed to, but one filled with curiosity and perhaps something more. Recognition. "You handle a lot, don't you?" he said after a moment, breaking the silence. Elena's hands stilled for a split second before she continued. "It's part of the job," she replied, keeping her voice light. "Is it?" he pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Or do you do more because you have to?" The question hung in the air, and Elena wasn't sure if he expected an answer. Before she could think of what to say, Richard's eyes softened, and he shifted on the bed, wincing slightly. "Thank you, Nurse Carter," he said, his tone warm. "You're good at what you do. Don't let anyone make you forget that." The days passed, and Elena began to sense a subtle shift. Richard Monroe's presence in the hospital seemed to influence those around him in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Staff meetings grew tenser as rumors swirled about who he was and why he was there. Whispers about a powerful board member evaluating the hospital surfaced, and Elena couldn't help but wonder if the man who watched her with such measured attention was more than just a patient. Jessica Lane began interacting with Elena more frequently, sometimes offering help during particularly rushed shifts. Other nurses noticed and seemed torn between following Jessica's example or maintaining the unwritten status quo. Dr. Holden's sharp eyes missed nothing, and one afternoon he confronted Elena in the hallway. "There's been talk about you, Nurse Carter," he said, his voice low and charged with barely suppressed irritation. "Talk?" Elena's heartbeat quickened, though she maintained her calm exterior. "Yes, about how you're influencing the team," he said, his words hanging ominously. Before she could respond, he added, "Stay in your lane." Elena's pulse thudded in her ears as she watched Dr. Holden stride away. Anger simmered beneath her professional facade, but she channeled it into her work. The subtle shifts in her relationships with colleagues, the guarded smiles from Jessica, and Richard Monroe's increasingly pointed questions, all of it fueled her resolve. Later, as she walked past Richard's room, she paused. He looked up from a book, meeting her eyes. "Don't let them win, Nurse Carter," he said softly, as though reading her thoughts. Elena nodded, a sense of solidarity taking root between them. She didn't know how, but she felt that Richard's words meant more than just comfort. They were a promise of something bigger, something she might be a part of if she dared. The fluorescent lights in the break room cast a harsh glare over the linoleum floor, exaggerating the lines of exhaustion on Elena's face. She sat at a small, round table nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The muffled sounds of the hospital, the beeping of monitors, the hum of hurried conversations, filtered through the half-open door. Jessica walked in, her expression unreadable. She hovered near the counter before finally taking a seat opposite Elena. For a few moments, silence reigned, and the only sounds were the occasional clink of Jessica's spoon against her mug. "Things are shifting," Jessica said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was tentative, almost as if she were testing the waters. Elena looked up, surprised by the openness. "You've noticed it too?" Jessica nodded. "Dr. Holden is on edge, and I think Mr. Monroe is more than just a patient." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Jessica glanced over her shoulder before leaning in. "I overheard Dr. Holden talking to Linda Reynolds. He was furious, saying something about a board member who has too much power to meddle. It has to be Monroe." The revelation sent a jolt through Elena's chest. It explained the subtle shifts, the glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked into a room. Richard Monroe wasn't just a patient. He was here to watch, to judge, and perhaps to change things. Later that evening, Elena found herself in Richard Monroe's room again, checking his IV drip and noting his vitals. He watched her silently, his eyes sharp and observant as usual. But tonight, the silence felt heavier, as though a shared understanding hung in the air between them. "Tell me, Nurse Carter," he said suddenly, breaking the stillness. "Why did you choose this hospital?" Elena's hands paused for a moment before resuming their work. The question was simple enough, but the tone of his voice hinted at something deeper. "It's known for being one of the best," she answered carefully. "I wanted to be challenged, to grow." Richard nodded, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "And have you found that? Growth?" Elena met his gaze, searching for the intention behind the question. "Not in the way I expected," she admitted, the honesty of her words surprising even herself. Richard's expression hardened slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Sometimes the greatest challenges aren't the ones we anticipate," he said, almost to himself. "But you've been doing more than just growing, haven't you? You've been surviving." The words struck her, resonating with the unspoken exhaustion she carried daily. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded subtly. Richard's gaze softened, and for a moment they sat in a companionable silence. "Things may be changing sooner than you think," he added, a hint of determination in his voice. The following days were marked by a growing tension in the air. Nurses exchanged nervous glances, and even Linda Reynolds appeared more preoccupied than usual, her conversations with Dr. Holden growing quieter but more frequent. Elena continued her work, each day blending into the next with relentless pace. One afternoon, Jessica found Elena in the supply room, rummaging for gauze. "They're calling a staff meeting tomorrow," Jessica said, her voice tight with apprehension. "Why?" Elena's fingers froze, her body tense. "No one knows, but there's talk that it has something to do with Monroe's evaluation." Elena exhaled slowly, the anticipation settling heavy in her gut. If the rumors were true, the meeting could be a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone at Briarwood. The next day, the staff gathered in the largest conference room. The chairs were filled, with many standing in the back or leaning against the walls. Dr. Holden stood at the front, his posture rigid and his jaw clenched. Linda Reynolds was beside him, her face unreadable. Richard Monroe was there too, sitting calmly in a chair at the front, eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. The hum of whispers fell silent as Dr. Holden cleared his throat. "We've brought you all here today to discuss the observations and reports we've been receiving," he began, his voice strained. "As some of you may know, Mr. Monroe has been evaluating our operations." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Elena could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, some curious, others anxious. Richard rose slowly, his presence commanding attention. "I have seen dedication, skill, and compassion here," he said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "But I've also witnessed things that must change. Biases, inequality, and practices that do not align with the standards this hospital claims to uphold." Murmurs erupted, quickly stifled by the severity of Richard's gaze. He turned slightly, looking directly at Elena, then back at the staff. "These changes start now." As the meeting ended, the staff dispersed with a mix of emotions. Relief for some, anxiety for others. "Doctor?" Holden stormed out, his expression dark. Linda Reynolds lingered, her eyes meeting Elena's for a brief moment before she looked away, as if acknowledging something she had previously refused to see. Jessica approached Elena, her face pale but determined. "Looks like you were right," she whispered. "Things are shifting." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of Richard's words settle into a new resolve within her. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time it felt like it could be fought and won. The meeting had stirred the pot more than anyone could have anticipated. The next morning, Briarwood Medical Center was abuzz with speculation. Some nurses and doctors kept their heads down, avoiding conversations that might touch on the sensitive topic of the hospital's future. Others whispered anxiously in the break room, eyes darting around as if they feared being overheard. Elena found herself the subject of many sidelong glances. Her resolve remained unshaken, though, bolstered by Richard Monroe's words. His support, though silent most of the time, was a beacon she clung to. Jessica approached Elena during their rounds. "Things feel different, don't they?" she murmured as they walked past a patient's room. "Yes," Elena said, keeping her eyes forward. "But different doesn't mean better." "Not yet." Jessica nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. The tension between them had thawed over the past few weeks, but trust was still a delicate thread that could break under too much weight. Later that day, Elena entered the staff lounge to find Linda Reynolds deep in conversation with Dr. Holden. They stopped abruptly when they noticed her, the silence so sharp it made the air feel brittle. "Doctor?" Holden's eyes glinted with restrained anger as he walked past her without a word. Linda, however, lingered for a moment longer, her gaze conflicted. "Elena," Linda said, her voice lower than usual. "A word, please." Elena's heartbeat quickened. She followed Linda into her office, where the blinds were drawn and the room felt strangely suffocating. Linda sat behind her desk, her fingers tapping a slow, erratic rhythm. "You've made an impression," Linda said, meeting Elena's eyes. "Both good and bad." "I'm just doing my job," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. Linda sighed. "Briarwood has its ways, and change isn't always welcomed. Watch your back, Elena. Not everyone here wants to see things improve." The warning hung heavy between them. Elena nodded, a mix of gratitude and wariness swelling within her. As the days passed, it became clear that not everyone at Briarwood would go quietly into the new era that Richard Monroe had hinted at. Small acts of defiance sprouted like weeds. Supplies that Elena needed were suddenly misplaced. A few of her colleagues began shifting their workload onto her with flimsy excuses, testing the limits of her patience. One day, during a particularly hectic shift, Dr. Holden intercepted Elena in the hallway. He leaned in, his voice barely more than a hiss. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you? Just because Monroe favors you." Elena's pulse raced, but she met his eyes squarely. "I don't think I'm untouchable, Dr. Holden. I think I'm doing my job, the same as anyone else." His smirk was sharp, cruel. "We'll see how long that lasts." The interaction left her shaking, a mix of fear and defiance churning in her chest. It was becoming clearer with each day that the fight ahead would be more personal and more perilous than she'd anticipated. Elena's resolve was tested further when Linda Reynolds called a meeting with the senior nursing staff. The room was tense, filled with skeptical faces and crossed arms. Linda stood at the front, her posture as rigid as a soldier's. "Changes are coming," Linda began, scanning the room. "Like them or not, we will adapt." Murmurs erupted, some louder than others. A nurse near the back muttered, "Adapt? For what? To please one man's vision?" Linda's eyes sharpened. "No, to uphold what this hospital is meant to stand for." For a fleeting moment, Elena thought she saw a crack in Linda's stern exterior, a hint of exhaustion and regret. But then it was gone, replaced by the professional mask she wore so well. After the meeting, Jessica sidled up to Elena. "That was something," she said, a hint of nervous laughter in her voice. Elena allowed herself a small smile. "It's a start." Richard Monroe's presence at Briarwood had grown more public. He attended rounds, exchanged words with patients, and observed surgeries from behind the glass of the observation room. Rumors swirled faster than ever, and Elena's name was often tied to them. One evening, as Elena was completing her notes, a soft knock sounded at her door. Richard stood there, his expression as serious as she had ever seen. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," she said, setting her pen down. He closed the door behind him and sat across from her, folding his hands on the desk. "I need to tell you something, Elena. This isn't just about Briarwood. It's about healthcare standards across the board. This hospital is only the beginning." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the changes we're pushing for here will ripple outwards," Richard continued. "But I need allies. I need people like you who are willing to fight even when it's difficult." Elena felt a surge of emotion, fear, pride, and a deep sense of purpose mingling in a way that left her speechless. She nodded slowly. "I'm in." A smile tugged at Richard's lips. "Good, because things are about to get more intense." True to Richard's words, the following days were marked by upheaval. Staff members who resisted change grew more vocal, their criticisms finding sympathetic ears among those who feared losing their old ways of doing things. Dr. Holden's influence loomed over many of these conversations, fueling discontent with sharp-edged comments and passive-aggressive gestures. One afternoon, as Elena was preparing for a routine check on a patient, she found a note taped to her locker. "Leave while you can." She crumpled it in her fist, eyes blazing with defiance. The message was anonymous, but she knew its meaning. They were trying to intimidate her, to force her out. But leaving wasn't an option, not now. The anonymous note was a stark reminder that change would not come without resistance. It fueled Elena's resolve, but it also left her feeling more alone than ever. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of whispers trailing her wherever she went. During a late shift, Elena found herself in the supply room, the fluorescent lights casting cold shadows along the shelves. She reached for a box of sterile gloves when the door creaked open behind her. She turned quickly, her pulse quickening. It was Jessica, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. "Hey," she said, stepping inside and letting the door close behind her. "You okay?" Elena took a deep breath, the tension easing slightly. "Just tired," she admitted. Jessica's eyes searched hers, and after a moment she nodded. "We're all feeling it. But you're not alone, Elena. Some of us, we see what you're doing, and we're with you. A wave of unexpected relief washed over Elena. For the first time, she realized that the silent support she had longed for might be there, just hidden beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. "Thank you, Jessica," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. The days leading up to the next staff-wide meeting were tense. Richard Monroe's presence in the hospital had become a topic of heated debate. His silent observations were now seen as a challenge to the status quo, and those loyal to Dr. Holden felt their authority slipping through their fingers. Linda Reynolds, who had always maintained a stern neutrality, began to show cracks in her facade. She called a meeting with Elena and a few other nurses who had shown willingness to embrace the changes. The room was small, the air heavy with anticipation. "I'm not going to pretend this will be easy," Linda said, her eyes moving from one nurse to the next. When they landed on Elena, they lingered for a moment longer. "But if we're going to turn this place into what it should be, we need to work together." Elena felt a stir of hope. It was the first time Linda had spoken so openly about change. The words were a call to arms, quiet but powerful. The meeting took place on a rainy afternoon, the steady patter against the windows matching the tension in the room. The entire staff crowded into the conference hall, the usual hum of conversation replaced by uneasy silence. Dr. Holden stood at the back, his arms crossed and eyes narrowed. Richard Monroe rose from his seat and surveyed the room, his expression solemn. "Briarwood is at a crossroads," he began. "We can either move forward together or continue down a path that benefits few at the cost of many." A nurse near the front, one of Dr. Holden's staunch supporters, scoffed audibly. "And who's going to lead us there? You?" she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Richard's gaze shifted to Elena, who felt the weight of every eye in the room turned to her. "No," Richard said slowly. "The people who lead us forward are already among you. People who show resilience and dedication in the face of adversity." Elena's breath caught as Richard's words settled over the room. The silence was palpable, punctuated only by the distant sound of thunder outside. Not everyone was moved by Richard's speech. Dr. Holden stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. "This hospital has run efficiently for decades without your help, Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice tight. "And we don't need outsiders telling us how to do our jobs." Richard's calm never wavered. "Outsiders?" he echoed. "Or people who care enough to see what this place could be?" The room erupted in whispers, some staff members shifting uncomfortably, while others exchanged knowing glances. Elena could feel the air crackling with tension. She clenched her hands in her lap, willing herself to stay composed. Dr. Holden's eyes found hers, sharp and unyielding. "And you, Nurse Carter, are you ready to gamble your career on this new vision of Briarwood?" The question was a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Elena rose slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Because this isn't just about me. It's about every patient who deserves the best care and every staff member who deserves respect and fairness." The room fell silent, the challenge hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, only an unspoken understanding that Briarwood was at a turning point. As the staff dispersed, Elena caught sight of Linda, who gave her a small nod, an acknowledgement of courage. Dr. Holden brushed past Elena on his way out, his eyes filled with something dark and unreadable. "This isn't over," he muttered. Jessica appeared at Elena's side, a hesitant smile on her face. "That was brave," she said, "and exactly what we needed." Elena exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening. The battle wasn't won, but it had begun. In the days that followed, the pushback became more pronounced. Medical charts were mysteriously misplaced, and patient care plans were altered without explanation. One morning, Elena arrived to find that a patient under her care had been reassigned without her knowledge. "It's Holden," Jessica said one evening when they were alone in the lounge. "He's trying to make you look incompetent." Elena clenched her jaw, anger flaring in her chest. "Let him try," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Rumors of sabotage began to circulate, and soon Other nurses started stepping forward to share their experiences. They spoke in hushed tones at first, their stories mirroring Elena's in subtle, disturbing ways. Supplies going missing, schedules being manipulated, shifts changed without notice. It was clear that Dr. Holden and his supporters were playing a dangerous game. Richard Monroe continued to show up unannounced, sometimes observing from afar, other times offering a word of encouragement that felt like a lifeline. The subtle show of support did not go unnoticed by those who clung to the old ways, and resentment bubbled just beneath the surface. One evening, Elena walked into the break room to find Linda Reynolds waiting for her, arms crossed and a conflicted look in her eyes. "We need to talk," Linda said. "I've seen what's been happening. It's unacceptable." Elena's heart leaped with cautious hope. "Then help me stop it," she said. Linda sighed, the weight of her position evident on her face. "It's time we make a stand." Briarwood Medical Center buzzed with an energy that felt both charged and brittle. Whispers filled the hallways, and the staff's glances were sharper, more pointed. Elena stood at the nurse's station, fingers flying over a keyboard as she entered patient data. But her mind was elsewhere, on the growing tension that thickened the air around her. Richard Monroe had been more visible, attending rounds and speaking in low tones with Linda Reynolds. The support Elena received from him had become less subtle. His acknowledgement of her efforts served as both a comfort and a warning. Every approving nod from Richard seemed to fuel Dr. Holden's fury, his eyes smoldering whenever they met hers. It wasn't long before Elena's pager vibrated urgently at her hip. She glanced at the screen. Conference Room C. Emergency Staff Meeting. She exchanged a brief, worried look with Jessica, who was nearby, before they both moved swiftly down the corridor, hearts pounding with anticipation. The room was already half full when Elena and Jessica entered. The hum of anxious conversation filled the air. Linda Reynolds stood at the front, her face pale but composed. "Doctor?" Holden lingered near the back, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Linda began, her voice steady but strained. "We have received word that an independent committee will be visiting Briarwood to evaluate our practices and culture." A murmur rippled through the room, and Elena's stomach clenched. This was bigger than she'd imagined. Richard's quiet campaign was gaining momentum. "Doctor?" Holden's voice cut through the noise. "An outside committee? This is outrageous. Briarwood has always regulated itself." Richard Monroe stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the room. "Self-regulation only works when it's done with integrity, Doctor Holden," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "And that integrity has been lacking." The silence that followed was suffocating. Holden's eyes locked onto Richard's with a look that spoke of old battles and grudges. But Richard's gaze remained steady, unfazed. In the days following the meeting, the hospital split into factions. Nurses and doctors who supported change began speaking out more openly, emboldened by the promise of an external review. Those loyal to Dr. Holden doubled down, creating an atmosphere that crackled with confrontation. Elena's shifts became a gauntlet of subtle sabotage. Supplies were moved or went missing, and patient charts she meticulously updated would sometimes be found altered or lost. But she wasn't alone. Jessica and a small group of nurses formed a quiet network of support, exchanging information and covering for each other when needed. One evening, Richard met with Elena and Linda in a secluded corner of the cafeteria. The lights were dim, and the room was nearly empty, save for a few late-night staff members grabbing a quick bite. "Things are escalating," Richard said, leaning forward, his eyes shadowed with concern. "The committee arrives in a week. When they do, we need to be prepared to show them what's really happening here." Linda's lips pressed together. "There will be pushback. More than there is now." Elena nodded, the weight of the responsibility heavy on her shoulders. "We'll be ready," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. 3 days before the committee's arrival, Elena walked into the supply room to restock for her next shift. Her stomach sank as she saw shattered glass scattered across the floor, the broken remains of medication vials. "Looks like someone's trying to make a statement," Jessica said from behind her. crossing her arms as she surveyed the mess. But it's not going to work. Elena forced a smile. We'll clean it up, and we'll keep going. Their determination was tested that evening when a patient under Elena's care developed complications. Doctor? Holden arrived in the room, a look of thinly veiled satisfaction on his face. I'll take it from here, Nurse Carter, he said, emphasizing her title as if to remind her of her place. Elena stood her ground, monitoring the patient's vitals and assisting as needed, even as Holden's critical gaze bore into her. The patient stabilized after an intense half-hour, and Elena left the room, her legs shaking. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard Richard's voice behind her. You did well, he said quietly, and people are noticing. The morning of the committee's visit dawned gray and heavy, clouds gathering in a sky that threatened rain. Elena felt the pressure like a tangible force as she prepared for the day, smoothing the front of her uniform and taking a deep breath before stepping into the main hall. The committee members, 4 in total, were an imposing group. Their expressions were neutral, their eyes sharp as they observed the routines and questioned staff. Elena watched them interact with Linda and Dr. Holden, whose smiles looked forced under scrutiny. A member of the committee approached Elena during her rounds. Nurse Carter, may we ask you a few questions? She nodded, her throat dry. The questions were pointed, focused on her experience and any challenges she faced. She answered truthfully, sensing the eyes of her colleagues on her as she spoke. When the day ended, the committee retreated to review their notes, leaving the hospital buzzing with speculation. The fallout came swiftly. Dr. Holden called a meeting for his supporters, attempting to rally them against the committee's influence and the changes Richard advocated for. His speech was impassioned, filled with half-truths about tradition and the danger of letting outsiders dictate policy. Elena was cornered later that night by Dr. Holden in the parking lot. The rain had started, pattering softly on the concrete. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage. You think you've won, don't you? He said, stepping closer. No one wins if this hospital stays the same, Elena replied, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. Holden's eyes narrowed. This isn't over, Carter. The committee's final report was announced a week later. The tension in the air was thick as staff gathered in the main hall. Richard stood at the front with Linda and the head of the committee, a stern woman named Dr. Vera Cole. The committee has found areas where Briarwood excels, Dr. Cole began, but we have also identified critical issues that need addressing, particularly around workplace culture and the distribution of responsibilities. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Doctor? Holden's face was pale, a vein throbbing at his temple. The recommendations include leadership changes and mandatory diversity and ethics training for all staff. Dr. Cole continued, her eyes sweeping the room. Effective immediately. The announcement was met with a mix of relief and outrage. Elena felt Jessica squeeze her arm in silent solidarity. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. With the report made public, Briarwood began its transformation. Dr. Holden's influence waned as Richard and Linda took charge of implementing the committee's recommendations. New training sessions were introduced, and staff meetings became more open, fostering discussions that had been stifled for too long. Elena stood at the forefront of these changes, her leadership and resilience earning her respect from colleagues who had once doubted her. Jessica became one of her strongest allies, their bond forged in the crucible of shared struggle. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard found Elena in the courtyard. "You've done more than just survive, Elena," he said, a rare smile breaking across his face. "You've led." Elena looked out over the hospital, where lights glowed warmly against the encroaching dark. "We did it together," she said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. The first few weeks after the committee's report were chaotic. New policies were drafted, and training sessions began in earnest. The staff of Briarwood, once split into factions, now found themselves sitting side by side, listening to lectures on ethics, inclusion, and best practices. Elena sat in the front row during the first session, flanked by Jessica and other supportive colleagues. Dr. Vera Cole led the training, her presence commanding and unyielding. "This is not just a formality," she said, her eyes moving over the room. "This is a necessity. A hospital that fails its staff fails its patients." Jessica leaned over and whispered, "I think she means it." Elena nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. The room was filled with mixed reactions, some attentive, others indifferent, and a few openly resistant. Dr. Holden, no longer part of the active administration, was conspicuously absent, but his loyalists wore defiant expressions. As the session ended, Linda Reynolds approached Elena. Her usually composed face softened into an expression that could almost be called a smile. "Good work today, Carter. Your input in the discussion was valuable." "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds," Elena replied, surprised but grateful. It was the first genuine praise she'd received from the head nurse, and it felt like a step forward. While many adapted to the new reality at Briarwood, some resisted with renewed vigor. Rumors circulated about a clandestine meeting among the old guard, led by former senior staff who resented the changes. The whispers of dissent reached Richard Monroe, who shared them with Elena during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "They're planning something," Richard said, his expression serious. "Holden may have stepped down, but he's still pulling strings from behind the scenes." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What do we do?" Richard's eyes met hers, the weight of leadership evident in his gaze. "We stay vigilant, and we make sure that whatever they're planning, we're one step ahead." The days that followed were tense. The atmosphere at Briarwood felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. Elena's every move was watched, her work scrutinized by those who opposed her. But she didn't let it deter her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. One evening, Elena was finishing up her shift when she noticed a light on in an office at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and familiar voices drifted out, voices she recognized as Dr. Holden's and two of his former associates. Curiosity, mixed with caution, drew her closer. She could hear the low rumble of their conversation, words like committee and sabotage, making her pulse quicken. Before she could step back, the door creaked open wider, and Dr. Holden's eyes met hers. A tense silence followed. "Eavesdropping, Carter?" he said, his tone a mixture of surprise and scorn. "I heard voices," Elena replied evenly, willing her voice not to shake. "It's late." Holden's lips curled into a smirk. "You're too nosy for your own good." He stepped closer, the fluorescent light casting sharp angles across his face. "You might want to remember that." Elena's jaw tightened. "Is that a threat, Dr. Holden?" He laughed, a dry sound that held no humor. "No, just advice." Elena's encounter with Holden lit a fire under her. The next day, she gathered Jessica, Linda, and a handful of nurses who had shown unwavering support. They met in a quiet corner of the hospital cafe, voices low but determined. "They're planning something, and we need to be ready," Elena said, recounting the overheard conversation. Jessica's eyes flashed with anger, while Linda's expression hardened into determination. "What do you need from us?" Linda asked. "Unity," Elena said. "If they make a move, we need to respond as one. No divisions." Linda nodded, the small group exchanging looks that carried silent promises. The anticipated confrontation came on a Friday evening. A sudden announcement from Dr. Holden's camp called for a staff-wide meeting, citing concerns over new policies affecting patient care. The real intention was clear to everyone. This was a last attempt to undermine the progress that had been made. Richard Monroe and Dr. Vera Cole attended the meeting as silent observers, their expressions unreadable. Elena and her allies stood near the front, their presence a quiet declaration of their commitment. Dr. Holden took the stage, his voice sharp and practiced. "We are here because we care about Briarwood's legacy, because we cannot stand by and let changes diminish what has made us great." Murmurs rose from his supporters. Elena's eyes narrowed as she listened, her fists clenched at her sides. "And who decides what's best for Briarwood?" Richard's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. The room stilled as he stepped forward, eyes scanning the crowd. "Is it those who cling to the past, or those who embrace the future for the good of all. Holden's face flushed, and for a moment it seemed he might lunge forward. But he remained still, the silence around him damning. The meeting ended not with a declaration, but with a shift. Staff members who had once wavered stepped away from Holden's camp, their faces marked with contemplation and the realization that the hospital's future could not be shaped by fear and resistance. Richard, Elena, and Linda met later that night. The air was thick with relief and exhaustion. "You did it," Richard said, his eyes warm as he looked at Elena. "No," she corrected softly. "We all did." The weekend after the fateful meeting was a blur of hushed conversations and cautious smiles. Staff members who had remained neutral began to approach Elena with words of support or simple nods that spoke volumes. Jessica found her during the Sunday shift, eyes bright with a newfound determination. "You've inspired a lot of people," Jessica said, as they prepared a patient's chart together. "Even the ones who won't say it out loud yet." Elena managed a small smile. The weight of the past weeks had been crushing, but seeing Jessica's conviction gave her strength. "This isn't over," she replied, "but we're getting there." Rumors of Dr. Holden's diminishing power began to circulate more widely. Reports from meetings indicated that his sway with the board had been weakened. He still commanded a group of loyal followers, but their numbers had started to dwindle as the reality of Briarwood's transformation set in. One morning, Elena was summoned to a meeting with Linda Reynolds, Richard Monroe, and Dr. Vera Cole. The room was bright with morning light streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. "We've received formal complaints about Holden's conduct," Linda began, her voice steady. "It's enough to warrant a review by the board." Richard leaned forward, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "This is the opportunity we need, but we have to proceed carefully." Elena felt the stirrings of hope, but kept her voice measured. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep doing what you're doing," Dr. Cole interjected, her eyes sharp and approving. "Your presence and resilience have been key. This review will set the course for Briarwood's future, and we need everyone on board." Dr. Holden was not one to go quietly. The announcement of the board's review triggered a flurry of defensive maneuvers. Meetings were called at odd hours, reports were filed, and subtle pressure was placed on those who still wavered in their allegiance. Elena received an unexpected visitor in the form of one of Holden's longtime supporters, Dr. Carter Mills. His manner was abrupt as he approached her during a shift. "Nurse Carter, can we talk privately?" he asked, eyes flicking nervously around the busy hallway. Elena hesitated but nodded, leading him to an empty patient room. "What is it, Dr. Mills?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I've worked with Holden for years, but this fight he's picking, it's gone too far. Some of us didn't sign up for sabotage and threats. We wanted to preserve what we thought was right." Elena's eyes softened. "It's not too late to change that," she said quietly. "Stand with us." Mills swallowed hard, a war of emotions playing out on his face before he nodded curtly. "I'll consider it." The day of the board review arrived like the calm before a storm. Staff were asked to stay in their departments unless summoned, and a somber quiet settled over Briarwood. Elena took a deep breath as she watched Richard and Linda enter the administrative wing, their faces a mix of determination and exhaustion. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. Finally, the doors opened, and Richard stepped out, catching Elena's eye from across the hall. He nodded, a small but telling gesture. Linda followed close behind, her expression unreadable until she reached Elena. "It's done," she said, exhaling shakily. "Holden has been suspended pending further investigation." Relief and disbelief coursed through Elena. She felt Jessica squeeze her hand, and they exchanged a look of triumph mixed with the lingering uncertainty of what lay ahead. The suspension of Dr. Holden sent shockwaves through Briarwood. Some staff members expressed relief openly, while others muttered discontent. The hospital's leadership underwent an overhaul, with Richard Monroe and Linda spearheading the transition to a more inclusive and supportive environment. Training sessions that once felt like empty gestures began to carry real weight. Staff meetings opened with honest discussions about workloads, fairness, and the importance of collaboration. Elena became an unofficial spokesperson for the nursing team, voicing concerns and suggestions that had long been stifled. During one of these meetings, Linda looked directly at Elena as she said, "We need to recognize those who have shown leadership and resilience. Nurse Carter has exemplified what we strive for at Briarwood." The room broke into polite applause, with Jessica grinning and giving Elena a thumbs up. The acknowledgement was a step toward healing the rifts that had plagued the hospital for so long. Elena's dedication and clear-headed leadership caught the attention of the administration. Richard approached her one afternoon, a thoughtful look on his face. "We've been discussing a new position, something that would allow you to oversee the training and mentoring of incoming staff. How do you feel about stepping up as the Director of Nursing Development?" Elena blinked, stunned. The offer was beyond anything she'd ever imagined when she first walked through the doors of Briarwood. "I'm honored," she said, a tremor in her voice. "And I'd be proud to accept," Richard smiled. "Good. Because we need people like you at the forefront." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as Elena transitioned into her new role. Her days were filled with planning workshops, meeting with department heads, and mentoring new nurses. The once closed atmosphere of Briarwood began to shift, room by room, conversation by conversation. Jessica became a trusted colleague and friend, assisting with the new training programs. "Who would have thought?" she said one evening, laughing as they packed up for the day. "We started this journey feeling like outsiders, and now look at us." Elena smiled, the warmth of accomplishment settling into her chest. "It's just the beginning," she replied. "There's so much more we can do." Elena Carter's new role as Director of Nursing Development brought with it a cascade of responsibilities. The days at Briarwood, which once felt overwhelming due to skepticism and subtle opposition, now felt fuller and more complex. She navigated back-to-back meetings, fielded questions from newer nurses, and drafted new protocols that would cement the hospital's new commitment to ethical practice and equality. But with each new policy came resistance. Some of the older staff members, set in their ways, pushed back against the changes with the quiet persistence of habit. Whispered complaints about the new order and thinly veiled criticisms surfaced, creating friction. One afternoon, Elena sat in her office, papers spread across her desk, and exhaustion lining her face. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Jessica stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a break," Jessica said with a smile. Elena's face softened. "You have no idea how much I needed this." Jessica placed a cup in front of her and took a seat. "You're doing great, you know, even if it doesn't always feel that way." Elena sipped the coffee, its warmth spreading through her. "It feels like for every step forward, there's always someone trying to pull us back." "Change takes time," Jessica said, "and stubbornness runs deep in this place. But look how far we've come already." Elena nodded, the encouragement lifting her spirits. Jessica was right. The journey was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. A few weeks into Elena's new role, Briarwood received an unannounced visit from the Board of Healthcare United, the parent company overseeing the hospital's operations. The board members walked the halls, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and scrutiny. Richard Monroe accompanied them, his presence a reassuring sight amid the tension. Elena led a tour, showcasing the changes that had been implemented. The new mentoring program was one of the highlights. Nurses were paired with experienced staff to foster a culture of mutual learning and respect. Dr. Vera Cole, part of the board and now a vocal supporter of the new direction, nodded approvingly as Elena explained the revised procedures. "This is impressive," Dr. Cole said, her voice echoing in the corridor. "These steps are necessary not just here, but across all our facilities." Richard added, "Elena's efforts have set a precedent. We'll use Briarwood as a model for other hospitals." Hearing those words, Elena felt a mixture of pride and the heavy realization of the expectations now resting on her shoulders. As the hospital began to draw attention for its improvements, the backlash grew. An anonymous email was sent to the board accusing Elena of promoting favoritism and overlooking critical flaws in the system. The claims were baseless, but enough to cast a shadow over her reputation. Richard called Elena into his office one morning, the email printed and laid out on the desk. His eyes were kind but serious. "We need to address this," he said, pushing the paper toward her. Elena's heart sank as she read the accusations. "I know this isn't true," she said, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "I know," Richard replied, "but perception is powerful. We need to be transparent and proactive." Together, they crafted a response plan, holding an open forum for staff to voice concerns and ask questions directly. It was risky but necessary to dispel doubts and maintain trust. The day of the forum arrived, and the hospital's auditorium was filled to capacity. Elena stood at the front, flanked by Richard, Linda, and Dr. Cole. The air buzzed with anticipation as staff members settled in, their expressions a mix of curiosity, concern, and skepticism. Elena took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Thank you all for being here. We're committed to ensuring that Briarwood remains a place where every voice is heard and every concern is addressed openly." Questions came quickly, some pointed and accusatory, others genuinely curious. One older nurse, a known supporter of Dr. Holden, stood up. "Why should we trust that these changes are for the better? We've seen initiatives come and go, but nothing sticks." Elena met the nurse's gaze, her own steady and calm. "Because this time it's different. This time, the changes are not just coming from the top down, but from all of us working together. And if we commit to this process, we'll build a better Briarwood. Not just for now, but for the future." The room was silent for a moment before a ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Richard nodded subtly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. The open forum eased some tensions, but the undercurrent of resistance didn't disappear entirely. Late one night, Elena found herself walking through a quiet wing of the hospital, her mind replaying the events of the day. A sound behind her made her stop and turn. "Doctor?" Holden stood in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "Still here, Carter?" he said, his tone edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice even. "Still here." He stepped closer, the silence stretching between them. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts," he said, his eyes dark. "Change isn't always for the better." Elena held her ground. "Change is inevitable, Dr. Holden. You can either adapt or get left behind." With a scoff, Holden turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Elena with a pulse that thudded heavily in her chest. The confrontation, though brief, reminded her that the struggle was far from over. Elena knew that to truly transform Briarwood, she needed allies beyond her immediate circle. She began reaching out to the senior staff, who had been skeptical but not overtly resistant. Lunch meetings, casual conversations, and one-on-one check-ins became part of her daily routine. One such meeting was with Dr. Carter Mills, who had once been a close ally of Holden but had shown signs of reconsidering his stance. They met in the hospital cafe, the hum of activity around them a comforting backdrop. "I've been watching," Dr. Mills admitted, stirring his tea absently. "And I can't deny that things are better now. The patients are happier, the staff more engaged." Elena leaned forward. "Then join us. Help us make these changes permanent." "Dr. Mills sighed, a small smile breaking through the tension on his face. "Maybe it's time." Months passed, and Briarwood continued to transform. The changes once met with resistance became the new norm. The mentoring program expanded, and new hires spoke of the hospital as a place of growth and opportunity. A celebration was planned to commemorate the anniversary of the hospital's turnaround. The atrium was decorated with lights and banners, and the atmosphere was one of cautious joy. Elena stood with Jessica, watching as staff mingled, their laughter and conversation filling the space. Linda approached, holding a glass of sparkling cider. "You did it, Carter," she said with a rare smile. "We all did." Richard took the stage, raising his glass to the crowd. "To everyone who believed in change, who fought for it even when it seemed impossible. This is for you." And to Elena Carter, whose resilience showed us what leadership truly means. The room erupted in applause, and Elena felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was not just a personal victory, but a collective one. a testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a shared purpose. As the celebration wound down, Elena found a quiet spot by the window, looking out at the city lights. Richard joined her, his expression thoughtful. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, the question lingering in the air. "Forward," Richard said simply. "There's always more to do. More hospitals to inspire, more lives to change." Elena nodded, the weight of the journey ahead settling comfortably on her shoulders. "Then let's get to work." Elena stood at the head of a conference table in the boardroom of Healthcare United's headquarters, her eyes scanning the faces of executives and leaders from hospitals across the region. It had been 6 months since Briarwood's reforms had begun showing measurable improvements, and the company wanted to replicate that success. Richard Monroe introduced Elena to the room. "This is Elena Carter, the Director of Nursing Development at Briarwood. She's here to share her experiences and guide us in implementing similar changes." Elena took a deep breath. Public speaking wasn't her favorite part of the job, but she knew this was bigger than her discomfort. "Thank you, Richard. The journey at Briarwood has taught us that change doesn't come easily, but it is worth every challenge we faced. We've seen firsthand how empowering staff, listening to their needs, and fostering a culture of respect can transform patient care." The room buzzed with anticipation as she outlined the steps that had proven effective at Briarwood. Mentorship programs, ethics training, and transparent communication channels. Questions flowed in, ranging from logistics to overcoming resistance from entrenched staff. After the presentation, one executive leaned forward, an impressed smile on her face. "We'd like you to consult for us, Elena. Your insight could help more hospitals achieve what Briarwood has." Elena exchanged a glance with Richard, who gave her a subtle nod. "I'd be honored to help," she said, the enormity of the opportunity sinking in. Back at Briarwood, Elena felt the strain of balancing her new consultancy role with her responsibilities at the hospital. While many staff members were thriving under the new system, challenges still arose. Some nurses struggled with the pace of change, feeling overwhelmed by new expectations. Jessica noticed the strain on Elena and caught up with her after a long day. "You've been running yourself ragged, Elena. You need to take a breath." Elena let out a tired chuckle. "I know. It's just everything feels like it's happening at once." Jessica gave her a playful nudge. "Remember, even superheroes take a day off." Elena smiled, appreciating the support. It was moments like these that reminded her why she fought so hard to change Briarwood in the first place. It wasn't just for the patients, it was for the people she worked alongside every day. Just as things seemed to be stabilizing, a new challenge surfaced. A highly respected senior doctor at Briarwood, Dr. Avery Kaplan, started raising concerns about the rapid changes. Unlike Holden, Kaplan's criticisms were measured and resonated with many of the staff who felt left behind by the shift. In a meeting with Elena, Dr. Kaplan voiced his concerns. "Elena, I understand that change is necessary, but we need to make sure we're not losing experienced staff who are struggling to keep up." Elena met his gaze, appreciating his honesty. "I understand, Dr. Kaplan. We've been moving quickly, and I agree we need to support everyone through this. Let's work on an additional support plan for those who need more time." Kaplan's expression softened. "Thank you. That's all I wanted, a chance for dialogue." The interaction underscored the delicate balance Elena had to maintain. Change was essential, but so was ensuring that no one was left behind. The increasing demands of her job left little time for anything else, but Elena knew she needed balance to stay effective. One evening she visited her father, Thomas, at his home. The cozy living room was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, and family photos lined the walls, reminders of her roots and the strength she had drawn from them. "I've been hearing about all the great things happening at Briarwood," Thomas said, pride evident in his voice. "But how are you holding up, Elena?" She smiled, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing her features. "It's a lot, Dad. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, or if it's too much for one person." Thomas took her hand in his eyes warm with understanding. "You're doing more than enough, baby girl. But don't forget, Even leaders need to lean on others sometimes. His words settled deep in her heart, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. As Briarwood's success continued to spread, Richard approached Elena with a new idea. They met in a small cafe not far from the hospital, where the smell of freshly baked pastries created a comforting backdrop to their conversation. "I've been thinking," Richard began, stirring his tea thoughtfully. "What if we create a training center at Briarwood? A place where nurses and administrators from other hospitals can come to learn from our experience." Elena's eyes lit up at the idea. A training center? That would be incredible. It could bridge the gap for so many who want to make changes but don't know how to start. Richard nodded. "Exactly. And with your leadership, I think it could be a game changer." The thought of expanding Briarwood's influence was both exciting and daunting, but Elena felt ready for the challenge. The proposal for the training center was approved, and the hospital began preparations. The first group of visiting nurses and hospital leaders arrived months later, eager to learn from Briarwood's journey. Workshops were held in the newly renovated wing, led by Elena and other key figures who had been part of the transformation. Dr. Kaplan, who had initially been hesitant, stood by Elena's side during one of the sessions. "You were right," he whispered, after one particularly engaging workshop. "We needed this." Elena's heart swelled with pride. The journey had been difficult, marked by trials and victories, but it was worth it. Briarwood was no longer just a hospital. It was a beacon of what was possible when resilience, leadership, and collective effort came together. As the sun set on another successful day at Briarwood, Elena stood in the atrium, now bustling with life and laughter. The hospital's walls, once a silent witness to tension and division, now resonated with hope. Richard joined her, a contented smile on his face. "Looking back, did you ever think we'd be here?" Elena laughed softly. "Honestly, there were times I wasn't sure, but every moment led us to this." Richard raised his glass in a silent toast to the future. "To Briarwood, and to leaders like you who make change possible." Elena looked around, her heart full. The challenges would never fully disappear, but they had built something that could endure them. Something strong, resilient, and ready for whatever came next. And in that moment, with the lights of Briarwood glowing warmly against the evening sky, she knew the fight had been worth it.